All right. Hello, and thanks to everyone who's joining us today to learn more about life experiences that drive lifetime income. My name is Kimberly Brown, and I work on an economic mobility strategy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And broadly, the goal of the strategy is to increase economic mobility for about 47 million folks who are in poverty in our country. And I'm really excited that this research is getting out into the world because we've been working on it for quite some time. We conducted an exploration of folks' life experiences in order to develop a common language and a fact base for the field by identifying a comprehensive set of mobility experiences, which we've defined as life events that, according to the evidence we've uncovered, have an outsized impact on an individual's economic position over time. And so as we were working on this research, it was really important to me, and well, important to all of us really, that during this process, these experiences be properly situated in a structural context, and that we account for gender bias, racial discrimination, wealth inequality, all of those things. And I think what we've tried to do is to make it really clear that each and every experience is strongly influenced by compounding and interrelated structural factors. And to account for these structural factors in a way that really acknowledges the pervasiveness of racism, gender discrimination, et cetera, I think that you really need to talk to the folks who are most impacted by those things. And that's what this work has done. And I think, to assign greater value to the expertise folks bring to the table, we need to do more studies like this. We've got sort of a narrow view of who's an expert in this society. And unless we begin to broaden that view, I think the solutions that we come up with are going to continue to be negatively constrained by a lack of diversity and ultimately will fail. And so that part of the research is really exciting to me. And the folks at Camber will talk more about the methodology and all those sorts of things. But I'm just really pleased that this academic research is buttressed by the real life experiences of thousands of people. Ultimately, my hope and the hope of the team that's been working on this is that we can use these findings across sectors, and that also that refreshed concept of expertise to really inform our activities to support economic mobility. So where and how we invest, how we collaborate with one another, how we meaningfully account for lived experience with grace and dignity. And so I'm hopeful that this attempt at building a comprehensive set of mobility experiences may also help the field align more closely on shared goals and outcomes, and that we can all work together more closely to improve economic mobility for millions of Americans. So with that little intro, I'm going to turn it over to the Camber team to talk in more detail about the research. You'll be hearing from Mark Allen, who's the Director of Shared Prosperity and lead at Camber Collective, and his colleagues, Joseph Zhang and Morgan DeLuce. And with that, Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kim. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for making all of this possible. It is our privilege at Canberra to host you today and to convene as part of an economic mobility field to talk through these life experiences that drive lifetime income, or what we call mobility experiences. Just by way of background, as Kim said, I lead the shared prosperity practice at Canberra Collective. I've spent the last 15 years animated by probably the same question that drives much of you, which is very simply, how can we equalize people's opportunity to build income and wealth? And I'm joined by my great colleagues, Joseph Zhang and Morgan DeLuce, who have been instrumental in shaping and releasing this research, and who will also be instrumental in taking it out to the field, to those of you who might be thinking about what this means for your investments, for your programs, and for your strategies, and helping to do that translation and application work alongside you. Just as a quick background on Canberra Collective and who we are, we're a strategy consulting firm that partners globally to address today's most urgent challenges systemically, sustainably, and equitably. We work with a whole range of clients and partners, from very small place-based service delivery organizations working at the community level, all the way through to very large philanthropies, multilateral institutions, and government agencies, who are all really trying to improve their work across a range of social issues. our world for today is the economic mobility field. And so concretely, what we try to bring to that field is insights on the unmet needs and opportunities to better serve populations, strategies to optimize investments and program effectiveness, and coalitions to define and achieve common goals. And we're really just warm in our hearts at having this time with you today. It's quite rare to actually get time directly with the field in this kind of number. So this central question, how do we equalize the opportunity to build income and wealth over time? That's why we're here today. And really why we're here today is that economic mobility has plummeted drastically in the US over the last 60 years or so. For many of you, this graphic that you see on screen will be familiar. Perhaps for a few of you, it is not. But at a high level, what this demonstrates is that whereas in the 1940s, if you were born in the 40s, you had a 90% chance of going on to earn more than your parents. That has now dropped to about a 50% chance for those born in the 1980s. So that's my generation. And that stark decline is obviously a cause for great concern because it gets to the heart of the breakdown in the American story. This American story in which everyone can advance economically simply based on work, effort, and equal opportunity. It remains pervasive, and yet we continue to accumulate data showing how elusive it has become for many. Most Americans believe that economic mobility is actually still prevalent, that it is a norm that most Americans will experience. And yet, paradoxically, as you see here on this bar chart, very few Americans have the conviction that they will experience economic mobility themselves. About 54% saying that they will either stagnate economically or expect to slide back in their income. And this is, I think, just a really useful grounding from the data we captured in our survey. And just something important to keep in mind contextually as we run through the presentation today. In terms of our time with you today, we have up to an hour. We will probably spend about 30, maybe 35 minutes presenting a preview of this research to you. There is a Q&A function, so please, as we speak, if there are questions that pop into your mind, please submit your question and we will aggregate those ourselves and try to speak back to at least some of them. If we see some questions that are coming up repeatedly, then we'll probably prioritize those. Please also be aware that this session is recorded, which means that if you do need to drop off early, you'll be able to catch it eventually on our website, which is www.mobilityexperiences.org. So, how do we equalize income and wealth and the opportunity to build income and wealth over time? Well, we tackled this question from one particular angle, which was to look at, firstly, the life experiences that are proven to impact lifetime income based on existing research studies. And we'll come back to that because we realize that research is never complete. And secondly, among these life experiences that are proven to impact lifetime income, what is the quantified impact of each of these mobility experiences on income over your lifetime? So really, we're trying to get both a sense of the totality of the life experiences that are relevant here, and also a sense of the proportionate importance of all of them, whilst recognizing that all of them play a critical role at some point or another. The way we did this is really twofold. There was a quantitative analysis, which we call the academic analysis. And in this side of the work, we looked at over 230 research studies that have identified life experiences and their impact on income. So it's a meta-analysis of sorts. When we looked at each of those studies, we identified the average income effect of each mobility experience based on the upper and lower range of their reported impact, meaning If we're looking at things like high school completion, we looked at what was the maximum income effect of completing life school reported in studies, what was the minimum. And we essentially drew an average from all of those ranges and extrapolated that quantified impact over the duration of an average lifetime. So that's the quantitative side. That's what we'll be focusing on today, what those research studies tell us. Separately, but very importantly, as Kim flagged, there is an important qualitative analysis that was done in the form of a survey of 4,000 Americans that was designed to be demographically representative of our country, but that did oversample deliberately towards individuals on lower and lower middle incomes. And as well as that, 20 interviews. And in the course of both of those, we really explored the perceptions and beliefs that Americans have as to their chances of economic mobility, other people's chances of economic mobility, which lifetime experiences they perceive as being most important generally, and also in their own experience, which of these mobility experiences has had the biggest impact. And so from that, we were able to draw some interesting lessons on how your profile and your life experience impact the way that you experience or don't economic mobility. So as I said, today, what we'll share is part one. So the life experiences that drive lifetime income according to this quantitative analysis. In future webinars and dissemination events, we will look at the survey results and Americans' perspectives on economic mobility. And then we're also excited to continue this research through 2024, looking at how capital flows into each of the mobility experiences we've identified, and trying to see which ones might be underfunded relative to the impact that they generate. Also looking at the interventions that have been commonly designed to increase access to these mobility experiences and trying to draw some conclusions as to what makes for a more or less effective intervention. And then in a part four, future release at the end of this year or early next year, we'll be trying to support the development of a predictive model, which will be an impact model that allows you to stack these different mobility experiences and look at the cumulative impact that you can expect multiple experiences to have over the lifetime. And we're proud to be supporting Future Edge of Georgetown University in that work. So before I hand over to Joseph and Morgan to walk you through a more detailed analysis of what we learned and why it matters, I will give you the cheat sheet. What did we learn really in 3 bullet points? Number one, we identified 28 of these mobility experiences that have been demonstrated in the current research to impact an individual's economic situation. And you'll see in a moment that these 28 life experiences can be clustered into 6 domains, broadly speaking. Secondly, we gained evidence that these mobility experiences really span the totality of a person's lifetime. They actually start before birth, and they continue through your childhood and well into adulthood. And of course, some of them are cyclical, which means that you may start and come back to a life experience or have one multiple times. And then thirdly, we learned, of course, that some mobility experiences have a more proven impact on income than others. And I want to be careful to caveat that finding. In some cases, that really is a validation that a life experience simply is more impactful on income specifically. But in many other instances, there are life experiences that have been understudied or whose impact has been studied in isolation, but which actually have a bigger impact when studied in alongside other complementary interventions. And so we recognize that there is scope for further research. We are not presenting this as total and final truth, but rather a starting point. If you apply an equal analysis to each life experience, which ones seem to rise closer to the top. And a final point of context before I hand over to Joseph is, of course, one thing we'll be coming back to in future discussion with this research is how important the quality of your life experience is, meaning it's one thing to have access to one of these life experiences. It's another thing to have access to it in a really structured and effective manner that meets your needs. And of course, completing a life experience. It's not enough to simply start to have access to a possibility. Systems need to ensure that each individual is able to really follow through and complete each of these life experiences. So please keep that in mind as I hand over now to Joseph and then Morgan to talk you through some of the more detailed findings.
Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate that. It's good to meet everyone today. My name is Joseph. I'm a manager at Camber Collective, and my background is in workforce development and education. So this work is very near and dear to my heart. As Mark mentioned on the previous slide, one of our findings from our analysis was that there are 28 life experiences that significantly impact a lifetime income. And we've organized them into 6 domains, just to make it easier to understand. But starting at the top left and going clockwise, the 6 domains are education, financial well-being, physical and mental health, social and family relationships, career progression, and community interactions. Now, some of these probably won't surprise you, such as education and career progression, but what we truly found was that these mobility experiences span a whole gamut of life experiences. And secondly, the structural barriers really have significant effects on who can access these experiences and the quality of those experiences, in many ways outside of the control of the individual. And these structural barriers are things like socioeconomic class, race, gender, location, and there are a lot more. And for those of you that have been in this field for a long time, you're probably well familiar with what some of these structural barriers are. On this next slide, we have listed out all 28 mobility experiences that have a known impact on lifetime income. Please don't feel the need to memorize all of these now. We will not be quizzing on these later either. We will walk through each of these domains and talk through each of the experiences there, but we wanted to just provide a one-stop resource where we list all 28 experiences. And if you download our research report on mobilityexperiences.org, you'll find a report with all of these experiences and their associated impacts as well. I think one of the things I do want to talk about on this slide is just the diversity of the experiences here. You really see things from really every experience along the full gamut of birth to adulthood in your life. Things like receiving job or skills training, having manageable student debt, accessing pre- and postnatal care, and avoiding repeated school disciplinary actions. And then there's some here like being born within a healthy birth weight that as an individual, you have zero control over in your life. And it really speaks to the importance of structural factors and structural barriers on your lifetime income. And that's a good segue, I think, to the next slide, where we wanted to dive in a little bit deeper into these structural factors and exactly what they mean. And while these experiences, as you just saw, do frame this from an individual framing, it is really important to note that our context is really shaped by factors outside of our control. And especially in the United States, with the history of discrimination, marginalization, and racism in this country, these are oftentimes also cut along racial lines and socioeconomic lines. And the quote that we have here from our lived experience research, one of the people we interviewed, just speaks to how this person's race really affected their ability to earn income and become employable. At Camber, one of the things we work on with all of our clients is to address these structural barriers. And this framework that you see here on the slide is a really useful tool that we use to understand how to tackle structural barriers at various different levels of society. I think a couple of takeaways I wanted to talk about on this slide. The first being, as you can see, structural barriers exist at various different levels, and all these different levels eventually compound on one another to create significant burdens on the individual. And these levels are at the societal, the community, the institutional, the interpersonal, and of course, the individual level. And one good example maybe I can use to walk through each of these levels is housing in the United States. So for instance, at the societal level in legislation, we know that there are zoning laws in this country. And it's well known that, for instance, single family zoning laws has been a way to exclude certain groups of people from certain neighborhoods. And at the community level, that has resulted in high mobility neighborhoods and low mobility neighborhoods. So these are neighborhoods with strong institutions at times, schools, workplaces, hospitals, etc. And then there are communities with poor institutions and less functioning institutions. And over time, that really does have significant effect on a person's social network growing up in these neighborhoods. So for instance, if you go to a school that's a little bit less funded, you might not have access to the right mentors that can help you develop skills and education in life. And then later on, that translates into your professional networks. And I think the last point I'll say is that these are many layers that then compound on the individual. And it's really hard to break outside of that because of those many layers. And what we know in our work at Canberra over many years is that interventions are really needed at each layer of the structure in order to really achieve efficacy for individuals. With that being said, I'd love to now dive in further to each of our 6 domains. The first one being education. So the education domain is a really important one because 2 of the highest impactful life experiences, mobility experiences, occur in this domain. And that's pursuing and completing a post-secondary degree education and graduating with a degree in a high-paying field of study. I want to take a second to kind of explain what this impact number means. And as Mark mentioned, what we did was that we took the average of the high and low of all the studies that we looked at for each experience to create a percentage impact number. So how you would interpret this is those who graduate with post-secondary degree can expect to see a 39% increase in their lifetime income. And for some of these experiences, you'll see that the range is pretty big in terms of the potential impact. And that's because of the variance that we saw in the studies that led to these numbers. But I also think it makes sense given the wide range of life experiences that exist across the country and the individual circumstances that people have. Some of the other experiences in this education domain are completing high school education, accessing extracurriculars during childhood, accessing pre-K and early childhood development opportunities, and avoiding repeated school disciplinary actions. Once again, I'll emphasize the importance of completing post-secondary education. We know from the studies that those who have a post-secondary degree can, on average, expect in their lifetime to earn $1 million more. That's a significant amount of money. And we also know that education is a category where structural barriers are quite prevalent. So for instance, majority white school districts receive $23 billion more in funding in 2016 than non-white schools. That's a pretty significant difference in state and local funding. All right, so the next domain that I want to dive into is financial well-being. In financial well-being, the most impactful experience was owning a business. This makes sense. It's a really high risk, high reward experience, but those who are successful entrepreneurs tend to reap the benefits of that. And the impact of owning a business was 15% on lifetime income. Other experiences in this category were experiencing financial inclusion, such as financial education access and banking, accessing non-wage employment benefits like healthcare and retirement, accessing public benefit programs like SNAP, and having manageable student debt, which is a very important one in the United States. In the United States, I think we do have a lot of structural barriers when it comes to financial well-being as well. So for instance, we have inconsistent access to financial resources and geographic distribution of financial institutions. Things like redlining are well established in this country. And statistically, we know that 13% of individuals who are Black are unbanked, while only 3% of white individuals are. But having access, like the quote from Maria from Florida on the slide indicates, is really important, because having access to credit oftentimes is an important way for people to take out loans later on in life and be able to have capital for building wealth. This next category is career progression, not a surprising one, and obtaining a first full-time job that offers opportunity for advancement, ranked among the top 8 in terms of potential impact on lifetime income at 24%. Other important experiences in this category included receiving job or skills training and avoiding involuntary employment, whether that being laid off or fired. Of course, obtaining your first job that offers opportunity for advancement, I think, is not a surprise for folks in terms of how important it is. But to merely put it in quantitative terms, one of the studies that we looked at and what we found was that starting wage that you get, the impact of that is actually quite prevalent even 4 years down the line. For instance, 60 years after your first full-time job, that wage difference, 60% of it is still applicable. And that's pretty significant over the long term. And if you think about that over the course of your lifetime, that's pretty impactful. All right, next I'll hand it to my colleague Morgan, and she'll talk through the rest of these domains.
Thanks, Joseph. So I'm Morgan DeLuce. I'm a consultant with Camber Collective. I'll dive into our 4th domain here, which is social and familial relationships. And I think the strong impacts in this category in particular really speak to the importance of community and belonging in driving people's upward mobility. Our relationships often open up the doors to opportunities and help us build really important skills throughout our lives in communication and trust building that then can support our long-term career growth. We found 5 experiences with strong impacts on lifetime income. These include receiving mentorship during adolescence, living with a working adult partner, either through cohabitation or marriage, having strong social and professional networks, and not having to provide unpaid care either for adult family members or for children. Receiving mentorship in adolescence is actually our 3rd most impactful experience across all 28 mobility experiences. It has an average impact on lifetime income of about 25%. And we found that a naturally occurring mentor outside of one's family, somebody like a sports coach or a boss at an after-school job, provides adolescents both with a role model and with a strengthened social network where future job opportunities might emerge, for example. And something really important to note here is that we found that students from low-income households often derive the most benefit from mentorship, but they're the least likely to receive it. So when we're designing interventions to enhance access to these experiences, it's really important to consider where programming could provide the most impact and to whom. And lastly, I want to talk about these last 2 experiences here around caregiving, just given their outsized impact on women. We were not able to disaggregate the meta-analysis findings by gender, but we know that women provide the bulk of caregiving in the United States. Mothers are paid about 71 cents for every dollar that fathers are paid. So ensuring access to affordable care for family members and children not only supports economic mobility across the population, but it can actually help close some of the gender pay gaps by supporting women to engage in the workforce at their full capacity, therefore improving their lifetime incomes. Now we'll move into the 5th domain, which is community interactions. This includes 4 experiences. The first is avoiding interactions with the criminal justice system, accessing stable and affordable housing, having reliable and affordable access to physical and digital infrastructure, things like mass transit and internet access, and living in a high mobility neighborhood. So a place where you and your neighbors have access to high paying jobs, high quality education, and the chance to achieve upward mobility. These 4 experiences have fairly similar impacts on lifetime income, between 7 and 9%. Of these, avoiding interactions with the criminal justice system has the highest impact at 9%. And we know that people who have been incarcerated are about 10% less likely to be employed. And when they are employed, they earn less. Probably not a big surprise to everyone on this call. We saw that lifetime income losses can be as high as $500,000, and Black and Hispanic Americans generally experience much worse outcomes. And while we don't have the cumulative impacts of all of these experiences yet, we know that many of these experiences, especially in this domain, intersect and amplify one another. So, for example, access to stable housing and living in a high mobility neighborhood can be really protective factors for folks, leading to a lower likelihood of interactions with the criminal justice system. Now, our last domain is physical and mental health. There are 5 experiences that we found here with high impacts on lifetime income. These include accessing care for mental and physical health conditions, having low exposure to traumatic experiences, including ACEs. These are adverse childhood experiences, often things like experiencing domestic abuse or witnessing violence in your community as a child. Being born a healthy birth weight, accessing pre- and postnatal care, and having access to adequate nutrition and a balanced diet in childhood. Now, of these, access to care for mental and physical health conditions has the largest impact at 13%. And when people are not able to access their healthcare, they're far more likely to develop serious health conditions that can then preclude them from engaging in the workforce. So people both lose out on income as a result of their poor health, and they're often impacted by the high cost of care, especially for conditions that may have been prevented or managed early on if care was available. In this quote on the right from Michelle, we can see how managing health conditions can really negatively impact a person's ability to earn an income across their lifetimes. And limited access to care is the reality for millions of Americans. Again, I'm sure that's not a surprise for folks on this call, and especially for those who earn low incomes. And a critical factor here, of course, is access to insurance. Without insurance, accessing healthcare, including prenatal care or mental health care to help manage trauma, for example, is next to impossible due to the cost. And this burden has disproportionate impacts on Black and Latino Americans. They're generally uninsured at rates of 10 to 17% compared to 5% of white Americans. I really want to stress that the mobility experiences are important not only for driving higher lifetime incomes for Americans, although that is the outcome that we studied, but so many of these experiences, like access to healthcare, are really just basic human rights and that support our well-being outside of our economic mobility. So we've covered the 6 domains. Excited to take your questions if there are any details that you want to dive into there. And before I pass it back to Mark, I'll just leave us with this final thought that this research is really just the very first step in this broader work that all of us are contributing to. And we really hope it can equip key stakeholders like all of you with information to develop and enact strategies, investments, programs that can most effectively drive upward economic mobility.
Thank you very much, Joseph and Morgan. I hope that's been a tasty preview for all of you on today's webinar. Again, please, if you'd like a little bit more detail on some of the nuances we found, check out the mobilityexperiences.org website, which is in beta phase right now, but we do have the report on there, and we'll be continuing to build out that website with more insights, some video documentary content, and also further research reports over the rest of 2024. Okay, where does this leave us? You've given us 35 minutes of your precious time, and we're grateful, but at the moment, what you have is information, and we're well aware that information comes out every week from all kinds of places. So what are our hopes for this body of work? First and foremost, I want to think about the field as a whole, this economic mobility field. And one of our hopes is that this research equips all of you to actually feel seen within this field. And the reason I say that is we're well aware that the economic mobility space really breaks down into two tiers. There's a very small nugget of organizations that are really squarely focused on tracking income and wealth, and that think purely in income and wealth terms. And then there's a much, much broader, more sprawling economic mobility field, which is all of the constituent parts that drive economic mobility. So housing sector, criminal justice sector, education sector, and so on and so forth. And our hope is that by producing this sort of research and insights, we can start to erode some of those silos that exist inevitably because of the way funding is structured, and try to build this story of economic mobility as a life journey that comprises at least 28 different parts. So that's, I guess, the field building basis for the work. But to get a little bit more specific than that, we're very aware from the feedback we've received that some of the insights in this report really strengthen and diversify the evidence base. There are many of you in this room and not in this room that do critical work. And we know that being able to bring a number, for example, to a funder or to a policymaker on the projected impact of your work on someone's lifetime income is a helpful fundraising tool, also a helpful way to support measurement, learning, evaluation, tracking, and so on and so forth. To get even more specific than that, and this is really what I think we're most excited to announce today, we are hoping to enable application of the insights from this work in the design of investments and programs and strategies at the field level. And so thanks to the generous support of the Cates Foundation, we will be offering strategic and technical support later on in 2024 and through part of 2025 to organizations that may be delivering programs that advance economic mobility, funding economic mobility initiatives as a philanthropy or as a government agency, making decisions at the local level around which areas of economic mobility to prioritize, how to allocate budgets and design policies that will work locally. And of course, to narrative change makers who are looking at the bigger picture, the story of America and the reality of America right now, and how to shift attitudes and beliefs around who has access to economic mobility and why. So more concretely, what we're hoping to do is to release a call for interest later on in 2024, where again, if you're delivering programs, funding programs, shaping policies, or trying to impact narratives, that you will have access to some strategic support from us, should you wish to have it. It'll be, of course, just an opt-in process, and we aim to roll out some of that technical and strategic support over the balance of 2025. Secondly, what I'll say is just a reminder, this is the start in a body of research, and there is more to come in the course of 2024, looking again at how capital flows and at how you can project the cumulative impact of accessing multiple life experiences. So with that said, thank you for your time. We can now switch over to the Q&A portion with the 20 minutes we have left. And if you have any further questions, do feel free to reach out to the Canberra Collective team offline, and we'll be happy to have conversations with you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to all of our wonderful speakers today for sharing this important research. We already have some excellent questions queued up. I encourage all of our attendees to please continue submitting questions via the Q&A chat function. We will do our very best to address as many as possible. So we will start with a question for Morgan. Did you find that any of these experiences had a negative impact on mobility?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So from a methodological standpoint, we took the absolute impact of these experiences. And for the most part, that leads to a positive impact on your lifetime income. But there are a couple of places where that differs. The main one being student debt. Probably no surprise there. And I saw there was another question on student loan forgiveness. So hopefully this gets at that a little bit as well. So student debt has been found to drive higher lifetime income because people generally pursue higher paying jobs out of motivation to then pay off the debt. But the benefits really depend on the amount of student debt and whether or not you do get that high paying job. You know, there are a lot of people that maybe take on loans, don't complete their degree, or aren't able to get a high paying job due to their field or many other factors. So there are some findings that show that debt over $10,000, which is probably many students in the United States, has negative impact. So our experience in the report is manageable student debt. We did want to capture that benefit because it is important and probably surprising. It was surprising to me that it can be beneficial to have student debt at all. So I do want to point out, like, there are differences in that benefit, and there can be a negative effect there. And that question on student loan forgiveness, we don't have research on that in this study, although my guess would be that student loan forgiveness would be extremely helpful for folks to increase their upward mobility. And I would be really interested to look into some studies on that. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Morgan. Joseph, I think becoming a homeowner is integral to the concept of the American dream. Is skepticism about economic mobility tied to skepticism about attaining home ownership? And if so, how much of an influence does that skepticism have about home ownership influence their perception of economic mobility?
That's a very interesting question. So what we saw in our survey of Americans that we'll talk more about in our second report was that the general concept of skepticism about one's own ability to get out of their own economic situation was not necessarily tied based to home ownership. Although I do recognize that in America, home ownership is a part of the quote unquote American dream, but we didn't look at that specifically. It was more a sense of, do people have a positive attitude about their own ability to achieve economic mobility? And one of the things I think it's also important to emphasize that it's not just the feeling that people have that they can't achieve economic mobility, like actual studies show that. I think, Morgan, you probably know the specific stat by heart much more than I do, but it does show that people, I think in 2010, who were in a specific social economic class weren't really able to get out of that. Yeah.
Thanks, Joseph. Mark, if you were a grant maker, where would you focus your dollars? And does size of geography make a difference?
Thank you. That's quite literally the $1 million question. I would say there's no sort of short answer to that. You can look at this research in the macro and say, okay, all things being equal, if we're looking nationwide, what are the mobility experiences that rise to the top in terms of their evidence? And you could justifiably say, you know, we're going to hone in on those top 10, say, and there will be some funders for whom that is an appropriate strategy. I think what we're hoping to get to in some of the technical support we provide in due course is more sophisticated analysis of local needs depending on the geography that the funder is trying to serve. So really breaking down these 28 mobility experiences and trying to understand what are the current outcomes in your community of interest and which mobility experiences are therefore going to be most salient to you. And then on the back of that, you know, we can help model out, excuse me, we can help model out different impact projections that you might aspire to have over the long term if you pursue some clusters of mobility experiences versus others. So I appreciate that's a slightly frustrating answer, but I think the reality of good strategy on investments is really marrying those macro insights that we have to the more place-based context, and hopefully we or others can support you in that.
Thanks, Mark. Joseph, I'm wondering how the impact metrics for domains shift when disaggregated by race. We know that Black women, for example, have some of the highest levels of secondary degree attainment, but how does their impact score differ from white individuals?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an important question. So because I think it's important to emphasize that the meta-analysis that these impact scores were based on was not new research that Kimber did ourselves. We were looking at a ton of different studies across the 230 that Mark mentioned. And because each of those studies have different methodologies and ways of treating race that we tried to equalize, we did not do that disaggregation there. But in the survey that we did of 4,000 Americans, we did break down that data demographically by a lot of different factors, including race, social economic class, were you actually able to experience mobility yourselves or not, location, and a ton of other factors. And then there are interesting results that we saw there. So the short answer is stay tuned. This is a little bit of a teaser that we'll release in that report. But maybe to give a little bit brief of the answer now is that we were actually surprised by how much consistency there was across race in terms of the perceptions of the importance of a lot of these experiences. There were notable exceptions to that based on different races that you'll see in that report. But there were some meaningful differences that we saw in other ways. The most important one being, did this person actually have this experience? Like that more than more than anything else really affected how people view the importance of these experiences.
Thank you, Joseph. Morgan.
One
Go
thing I
ahead.
would add to that is, as you think about the mobility experiences in their totality, what they're measuring at their core is an economic impact. So it's really, as a first lens, it's looking at your socioeconomic class, for want of a better word, and how these mobility experiences can change that socioeconomic ranking and opportunity over your lifetime. And so we find it useful to, yes, continue to center race and gender and location and disability and many other things, but also to start with the question, what quantitative, economic impact will this have from a class perspective? And then how does that break down further on a race, gender, location, and other bases? So I say that because one of our commitments is to try to layer in a more intersectional way the way that we address inequities, and that's a prism that I think comes out in this research.
Thanks so much, Mark. Morgan, what were some example areas that needed more research and that you could hypothesize would have a large impact on economic mobility?
It's a really good question. I guess I'll say all 28, there's always room for more findings and more research. From my perspective, the ones that I would be really excited to see more research on would be those earlier life experiences, particularly ones related to health, like prenatal care, healthy birth weight, and access to, those really early life experiences, maybe like pre-K as well. And the reason for that is because conducting longitudinal studies that find impacts very far down the line are really hard to conduct and really difficult to fund. So if there are funders on the line, I really encourage you to support those longer term studies. So I would be really excited to draw more concrete lines through those experiences. Joseph or Mark, if you have any other thoughts there, would love to hear what you would be excited to see too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note the flip side of that is that there are certain experiences that are very well studied, and the really well studied ones are things like graduating from college, achieving post-secondary degree education and mentorship. Those, I think, pull from several different studies in the meta-analysis, whereas others, like the ones Morgan mentioned, sometimes only had 1 or 2 studies that fed into that impact number. So for those, the more obviously the merrier. And especially also gets to the point at like the more studies that we have that include different communities, then we have a more representative impact for those studies. And because we have so many studies on things like post-secondary degree education, we're more able to flush out, for instance, that which communities would benefit the most from this experience from an impact perspective. So for instance, for college, we know that first generation college students, for them completing that degree is very, very, very important. Yeah.
Thanks, Joseph. Mark, what were some are there outcome measurements or data collection points that you can recommend for organizations working to advance economic mobility to measure impact and advance research?
Great question. Yes. I think the specific flavor of outcomes that you track really depends on your strategic priorities. But at a basic level, the way we try to think about tracking is across 3 different realms: the realm of economic security, the realm of upward mobility, and the general realm of sort of power and voice. And so under economic security, a lot of what we like to focus on is really the extent to which households and communities are able to meet their basic needs and to live in a stable manner, to sort of build that groundwork that you need before you can even start to project forward and upwards. And so there's a whole range of metrics that you could use to track economic security. I think it would depend on what you're looking to tackle, but you can look at things like food insecurity, you can look at housing stability, you can look at sort of those core everyday needs. Under economic mobility, those tend to sort of include things like education, workforce development outcomes, access to capital to start a business. And so they are a little bit more monetary sometimes in nature. Obviously, when you're talking about economic mobility at its core, you're talking about either an increase in income or wealth. And so those sort of metrics become a little bit more relevant. And then thirdly, and finally, under the sort of power and voice, you can look at civic engagement metrics. You can look at the distribution of resources. You can look at who is making decisions, whether it's at the local, state, national level, who is represented in those rooms. And relatedly, what are the narratives that are impacting some of those big picture debates? So I would say, all things being equal, keeping in mind economic security, economic mobility, and power and voice will give you a really holistic range of meaningful metrics to track.
Can I jump in here to Tess? Mark is basically getting at all of this, but I would encourage you all to look at Urban Institute's mobility metrics tool. It provides a lot of really concrete metrics that you can measure against in your communities.
Thank you, Mark and Morgan. Joseph, Chetty has done a lot of work looking at cross-class social capital, i.e. economic connectedness. Did you see that influence anywhere, maybe in mentorship?
Yeah, I think this speaks a little bit to the work that's still ongoing right now in terms of looking at the intersectionality of a lot of these experiences. So it's definitely something that we're interested in. We're partnering, as Mark mentioned, with Future Ed and Georgetown University to try and do. Excuse me. But for a lot of these experiences, you can see the interconnectedness amongst them with economic connectedness. So for instance, living in a high mobility neighborhood will probably give you access to things like mentorship and graduating from high school. We know that schools in those neighborhoods tend to have higher graduation rates. TBD on exactly like what is the quantitative effect of that, if we're able to see something like that. But just based on like the experiences that we have doing this work, we know that there is a lot of interconnectedness across different experiences, class, so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thanks, Joseph. Morgan, can you provide us with examples of how specific mobility experiences have been successfully leveraged to improve economic mobility outcomes?
Yeah, it's a good question. All of them have shown to have leverage to improve economic mobility outcomes. The one that's coming to mind, which we'll get into a little bit more in our third report, we'll talk through interventions that are really successful at driving these mobility experiences. Year Up is one of the interventions that we look at, and that provides job skills training for folks and work placement opportunities. And something that we find for that experience and for many other interventions is this sustained impact and I guess cohesive support system that touches on multiple aspects of your life to drive upward mobility make for really successful interventions. So again, sustained impact over time and a comprehensive support system through that intervention can be really pivotal in ensuring access to these mobility experiences. So stay tuned for report 3. We'll definitely go into more detail there.
Thanks, Morgan. And on that note, I will end with one final question for Mark, and then Mark, I will let you wrap this up. Were these experiences explored for cumulative impact?
Not at this stage. We certainly have some hypotheses on which experiences might stack most coherently together in different parts of the country, in different communities that have different needs. So we have some theories, and as we alluded to earlier, our work with the 4th brief that we release late this year, early next year, will be to share out what a model might look like as you're looking to model cumulative impacts. But at the moment, what we've been trying to do is really, honestly, to start from these basic principles. One of the issues we see in the economic mobility field is that there are sometimes still these critical basic knowledge gaps. And so before we get into the more sophisticated end of research, what we've tried to do with this research is to set the landscape. What are the 28 things that we know currently matter the most? What is their individual impact? Whilst recognizing that, of course, you know, in the messy world of reality, you're unlikely to just have one mobility experience. You need to have more than one. And so we will be working to track that and to give you a more quantitative answer really through the work of our friends at Future Ed. With that, thank you all very much for giving us your time. I hope that this will have been of interest to you, but more importantly, that it feels applicable to your work as you think about your investments, your programs, and your strategies. Please stay tuned on mobilityexperiences.org. Please reach out to the Canberra Collective team if you'd like more information. And we look forward to speaking with all of you again over the coming months.